I watched as the waitress placed that chipped coffee mug in front of me. She didn't look me in the eye, she looked at my coat, held together by rusty safety pins just so it wouldn't fall apart. "On the house today, Ron," she whispered, and I felt the heavy weight of her pity. To her, and to everyone in that dusty Vermont diner, I was just a lonely old man who didn't have a penny to his name. But what no one there could have imagined, the secret I guarded beneath that wrinkled skin, is that at that very moment, I was the owner of an $8 million fortune. I wasn't just saving pennies, I was hiding an empire that would make banks tremble. If you stay with me, I'm going to tell you how I, a man who cleaned toilets, managed to fool the system, my neighbors, and even my own family to protect a truth that would change everything. I'm going to show you that real wealth doesn't make a sound, it hides in the silence. If you seek what lies behind appearances, you are in the right place. I need to confess, and I need you to listen closely, I wasn't born to be a hero, much less a millionaire. I was born in 1921, in Dummerston, a land where silence was the only thing we had in abundance. I am a child of the Great Depression. Do you know what it's like to grow up learning to fear hunger before you even learn to read? I saw strong men, my neighbors, weep because they didn't have a cent for their children's milk. That image remained engraved in my soul like a scar that never closed. There, on that harsh farm, I learned the most important lesson of my life: the world respects what you show, but it only fears what you keep. My father walked miles just to save a nickel, and I watched the shame in his eyes when he couldn't provide. I promised myself I would never feel that shame. But I also realized that the moment people know you have something, they try to take a piece of it. To be safe, I had to be invisible. When World War II exploded, I was sent to North Africa and Italy. I saw the world burn, I saw entire cities turn to dust under artillery fire. It was there that I understood the fragility of everything people call success. Medals, titles, luxurious houses, all of it can disappear in a second. But what you carry in the silence of your mind and the capital you accumulate in the shadows, that travels with you. When I returned home, I was no longer the same young farmer. I was a man who understood that security didn't come from lights or applause, but from absolute anonymity. I saw generals who were nothing without their stars, and I decided I would be a king without a crown. I took a job as a gas station attendant. For 25 years, I was the man you ignored while looking at your watch, impatient to continue your journey. I cleaned the windshields of Cadillacs and Lincolns of men who didn't even know the color of my eyes. To them, I was just a mechanical accessory of the station, someone without a face and without a story. But while I cleaned the grease from my nails, I was operating a machine that none of those men in suits would dare imagine. I realized that the more they tried to look rich, the more they were slaves to their own debts. I saw the despair hidden behind the forced smiles of those who paid with crumpled bills. I decided, at that moment, that my life would be the exact opposite. I lived in a small house, without luxuries, and drove a car that was a local joke. I wore clothes that seemed to have belonged to my grandfather. But every night, after my exhausting shift, I sat at the kitchen table and opened the Wall Street Journal. I didn't read the news about politics or gossip, I studied company balance sheets. I looked for what I called real companies, those that manufactured what people needed, not what they wanted. I was looking for the veins of the world. The invisible janitor. I left the gas station after 25 years of faithful service, but don't think I was going to rest. I simply traded one uniform for another. In 1979, I started working as a janitor at JCPenney. If at the station I was the grease man, now I was the mop man. To the world, I had descended another step on the social ladder. To me, I was just moving to an even more privileged vantage point. I was about to perfect the art of being nobody, and I needed you to understand why. Imagine the scene, a cold Monday morning in Brattleboro. The mall opens its doors and the first customers enter, eager for sales, new clothes, and promises of happiness wrapped in gift paper. In the middle of that unbridled flow of consumption, there I was. A man of nearly 60, pushing a gray cleaning cart, with a bucket of yellowish water and a mop that had seen much better days. I walked with my head down, but it wasn't out of shame, understand that. It was by strategy. I learned early on that if you don't look at people, they stop seeing you. I became a ghost in a temple of consumption, and I loved every second of it. I saw the glint in people's eyes as they swiped their credit cards, trying to fill emotional voids with objects that would be in the trash in less than a year. I heard the conversations of managers, men who felt powerful behind their mahogany desks but lived suffocated by quotas, mortgages, and the constant fear of being replaced. I felt a deep, almost delicious irony burning in my chest. I was there, cleaning the dirt of those who, technically, worked for me. At that moment, I already owned shares in JCPenney and dozens of other companies that supplied every product I saw on those shelves. I was one of the owners of that empire, but I preferred to be the man who emptied the trash cans. My psychology was shielded against the pressure that crushes most people. We live in a culture that screams, "Look at me," that begs for validation. I did the opposite. I whispered to the world, "Forget I exist." I wore a wool coat so old the fibers were worn, held together by safety pins so the broken zipper wouldn't let me get cold. My shoes were patched with gray duct tape. To anyone passing by, I was the picture of misery, a reminder of what they didn't want to become. But to me, that was my suit of invisibility. I knew that luxury attracts parasites and envy, but apparent poverty? It attracts only indifference. And indifference was the oxygen I needed to operate my plan without interference. I didn't need applause, I needed time and compound interest. There is a specific kind of power in being the person everyone looks past. You hear the secrets they think no one is listening to. You see the cracks in their facades. I watched the wealthy shoppers argue over pennies while I held millions in my brokerage account. They were performing, I was prevailing. My mop was my scepter, and the linoleum floor was my kingdom. I wasn't just cleaning, I was observing the very mechanics of the economy I was slowly beginning to own. The Ghost of Wall Street. Imagine the chaos of Wall Street in the 80s. Cinema tries to portray it, but the reality was much more visceral. It was an era driven by adrenaline, greed, and split-second decisions that destroyed the fortunes of generations. Young brokers screamed into phones, sweated in their linen suits, and consumed substances to keep up with the frantic pace. And where was I? I was sitting in my worn velvet armchair in Vermont, with my feet on a wooden box I nailed together myself, reading the Procter & Gamble annual report by the light of a 40-watt bulb. I was the exact opposite of the market. I was absolute silence in the middle of the deafening noise. I didn't look for the next big thing or the tech company that promised to colonize Mars. I looked for what I called the veins of the world. I invested in companies that made soap, razor blades, medicine, and food. I understood a truth that Harvard geniuses ignored. No matter how deep the crisis, people still need to brush their teeth, wash their clothes, and take a painkiller. My technique was so simple it was almost offensive to those who complicated finance. I bought shares of solid companies and, once that paper came into my possession, it never left. I didn't sell. Ever. I survived Black Monday in 1987, when the market melted in a single day and men in suits jumped from windows in New York. I saw the dot-com bubble burst in 2000 and the 2008 housing crisis nearly bring the global financial system to a total collapse. In each of those moments, while the world panicked and people sold everything they had for fear of losing the little that remained, I did something that required a courage no one suspected a janitor had. I did nothing. Or rather, I did what the masters do in the dark. I bought more. To me, a market crash wasn't a disaster, it was a clearance sale of high-quality assets. I was buying the future at a discount, while others were trying to save what was left of the present. The real magic of my life, however, wasn't in what I bought, but in what I did with what I earned. I was a master of dividends. Every time a company deposited a few cents per share into my account, I reinvested immediately. I didn't use that money for a better dinner, for a new television, or to fix the roof of the house. I used it to buy more soldiers for my capital army. I understood the law of compound interest with a clarity that few PhDs possess. I knew that, in the beginning, growth is slow, almost invisible, like a seed under the earth. But I also knew that after decades of unshakable consistency, it becomes an exponential force, an avalanche that nothing can stop. I was building a financial cathedral, brick by brick, while the world thought I could barely afford my daily bread. I held physical stock certificates, real papers with wax seals and signatures, that I kept in a safe deposit box at the local bank. Those papers were my proof that I was, technically, a partner in some of the largest empires on the planet. I was the owner, while others were just consumers. I was the ghost of Wall Street. No billion-dollar hedge fund and no expensive suit analyst could detect me. I didn't have a Twitter account, I didn't give interviews, and I didn't appear on Forbes lists. I operated on a time frequency that modernity has forgotten, the frequency of decades. I wasn't playing the quarterly game, I was playing the eternity game. I was proving that the financial system, often seen as an enemy of the worker, can be a tool of absolute liberation, provided you are willing to be invisible while you climb the ladder. The mask of poverty in Barbary had reached what economists call escape velocity. My investments now generated more wealth in a single market day than I earned in an entire year of hard work at JCPenney. But instead of this financial freedom leading me to spread my wings, it made me close my cocoon of simplicity even tighter. I wasn't just an economical man, I was a man who had transformed deprivation into a form of art and protection. I had to be invisible to be free. Imagine the life of a multimillionaire. You probably visualize private jets, dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants, and designer clothes that cost the price of a popular car. Now, look at me. I lived in a two-bedroom house in Brattleboro that seemed frozen in the 1940s. The wallpaper was faded, the furniture was second-hand, and the only real luxury was the warmth of a fireplace I fed myself. I spent my weekends chopping wood with a blunt axe, refusing to buy a modern chainsaw because the old one still worked. I wasn't just saving money, I was preserving the identity that kept me safe from the world. I knew that the moment I started spending, I would become a target. And I preferred to be a ghost. My relationship with Barbara was my only safe harbor, but even there, the secret of my fortune was an invisible barrier that I never allowed to be fully crossed. I loved her with every fiber of my being, but I was a guardian of secrets by nature. We lived a life of stability, but without any extravagance. When she fell ill, I cared for her with a dedication that no money could buy. But even in the most difficult moments, I never used my wealth to buy privileges or elite treatments. I trusted the public health system, the same system I cleaned as a janitor. I saw money as a resource for the future, an army that shouldn't be wasted in individual battles, but kept for a final war that only I knew. I was saving for something much bigger than my own comfort. There were moments when my mask almost fell, and I confess I felt an almost childish pleasure in those times. Once, I was at the local library, my daily refuge, and an acquaintance saw me reading the Wall Street Journal. The man, trying to be kind, commented, "Ron, why do you waste time with that? That world isn't for people like us." I just gave an enigmatic smile and replied, "I like to see how others lose money." He laughed, thinking it was the joke of a grumpy old man. Little did he know that I was, at that moment, analyzing the quarterly report of a company in which I owned more shares than the CEO himself. I was the owner of the store where he shopped, but he felt sorry for me. That was my greatest victory. My frugality bordered on the absurd to those who saw me from the outside. I drove a 20-year-old used Toyota that I repaired myself, covering the rust holes with gray duct tape. I parked the car 3 blocks away from the hospital or the library so I wouldn't have to pay the 50 cents for the parking meter. To me, those 50 cents weren't just coins, they were seeds. I mentally calculated that those 50 cents, invested at an 8% annual rate, would be hundreds of dollars in a few decades. I lived in the future, sacrificing the present on an altar of compound interest that no one else could see. I didn't see what I was losing, I saw what I was building. Solitude became my most faithful companion after Barbara's death. I could have used my fortune to travel, to live in a luxury hotel, or to surround myself with comforts. Instead, I became even more reclusive. I frequented the same diner every day, sat on the same bench, and ordered the cheapest coffee. I became a folk figure in town, old Ron, the man who wore a coat held together by safety pins. There was once a woman in the supermarket line who, seeing me counting coins to pay for a quart of milk, tried to pay the bill for me. I politely refused, feeling the ironic weight of being one of the richest men in the state while receiving offers of charity. At that moment, I realized that people's perception is their own prison. They can only see what you wear, never what you possess. The final verdict time, that implacable judge I used so much in my favor, finally came to collect its last installment. At 92, the machine that sustained my iron discipline for nearly a century began to fail. But while my body weakened, the empire I built in the dark was at its absolute peak. I was about to stop being poor Ron to become the most unbelievable chapter in Vermont's history. I was ready for my last and greatest confession. I knew the end was near. The smell of antiseptic at Brattleboro Memorial Hospital was familiar, almost comforting. It was the same hospital where I cleaned the floor, where I saw life begin and end for so many others. Now, it was my turn. I was lying in an ordinary bed, in a room that had nothing special. A young nurse, with a crooked badge and a look loaded with tired sympathy, brought me some gelatin. She treated me with the delicacy reserved for the helpless. To her, I was just another lonely Vermont senior, a man whose calloused hands told the story of a life of effort and little reward. She had no way of knowing that, technically, I could have bought that entire hospital and still had money left to build another. I felt a deep peace, a satisfaction that burned softly in my chest. I looked at the white walls and thought of my soldiers, the thousands of shares of Procter & Gamble, J.P. Morgan, Johnson & Johnson. While I breathed with difficulty, they continued working. The market doesn't sleep, and my fortune continued to multiply silently, even in my last minutes. I was the master of a cosmic joke. I was dying like a pauper in the place I was about to save. I closed my eyes and saw Barbara's face. I hoped that wherever she was, she finally understood why I kept so much. It wasn't out of greed, it was for this exact moment. It was so that my silence could, finally, scream. In June 2014, my silence became eternal. I died as discreetly as I lived. There was no fuss, no immediate headlines. The funeral was small, attended by half a dozen neighbors who still felt that bit of pity for the old janitor. They commented in whispers how I had worked hard until the end, how I was a simple man who never had anything. Little did they know the show was just beginning. The real story didn't end with my last breath. It began 3 days later, when my will was opened in Attorney Miller's office. I wish I could have seen his face. Attorney Miller expected to find debt papers or, at best, a few $1,000s to cover my funeral expenses. Instead, he found a mountain of physical stock certificates, dividend records spanning decades, and bank accounts totaling something no one in Brattleboro could process. $8 million. The silence in that room must have been deafening. The man who used safety pins to hold his coat together was, in fact, one of the greatest philanthropists in the state's history. The news didn't just run through town, it exploded like a real grenade in the middle of a field of appearances. The waitress at the diner, who so often gave me free coffee out of pity, froze when she heard the news on the local radio while serving another customer's coffee. Ron? Ron was a millionaire, she asked, letting the coffee pot tremble in her hand. She remembered all the times she gave me free coffee out of pity, all the times she thought I was starving. The neighbor who tried to give me $20 to help with the wood felt a chill down his spine. The whole world began to look at me not as a loser, but as a master. I had fooled everyone, not out of malice, but out of a visceral need to protect my essence. I proved that people's perception is a distorted lens that only sees the surface. I didn't leave my fortune to distant relatives who never visited me or to anonymous investment funds. I directed the result of 70 years of mops and grease to the pillars of my life. I donated $4.8 million to the hospital where I was lying and $1.2 million to the library where I sought refuge and knowledge. It was the largest gift those institutions had ever received in over a century. The man who read the newspaper at the library to save on home electricity was now the man who ensured that library never had to worry about a budget again. The man who cleaned the hospital floor was now the man who funded the technologies that would save thousands of lives. I didn't want my name in gold letters. I wanted my effort to turn into pure utility. The legacy of silence. I spent 92 years preparing for this moment, every second of deprivation, every choice to remain in the shadow while the world screamed for attention. Now that Mile has been opened and the initial shock of Brattleboro has turned into an urban legend, I need to tell you what really happened in those final moments. I need you to understand that money was never the goal, it was just the byproduct of a freedom most people will never have the courage to experience. This is my last confession, the secret I took to the grave and now hand to you. Can you feel the weight of the silence? Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of one who possesses everything and needs nothing. Ronald Red, the janitor, the gas station attendant, the man in the patched coat, that man died. But what was born in his place was a lesson that hurts the soul of modern society. I spent my whole life being underestimated, and I confess that was the greatest gift the world could have given me. When people expect nothing from you, they give you the key to absolute freedom. I saw you, there on the other side of the screen, chasing validation, buying things you don't want to impress people you don't even like. I saw you sacrifice your peace of mind for an image of success that only exists in a digital frame. I looked into this abyss of consumption and simply turned my back. I didn't need anyone to know my name, because I knew who I was every time I looked at the balance of my shares in the dark of my living room. Real wealth, the kind I cultivated like a sacred seed, is not about what you can buy. It's about what you can refuse. I refused luxury to be able to own my own time. I refused fame to be able to own my own soul. I transformed the act of cleaning the floor into a ritual of liberation. Every movement of my mop at JCPenney was a step away from the slavery of debt and a step closer to total autonomy. I was the owner of the system while pretending to be its most insignificant gear. And I ask you now, with the honesty of one who has nothing left to lose, who is the real prisoner? The man who cleans the floor knowing he owns the building, or the man who sits in the leather chair owing every cent of his lifestyle to the bank? I want you to think about your own life for a moment. Look around you. Look at the things you've accumulated and ask yourself, do these things serve me or do I serve them? I chose to serve nothing but my silent purpose. I lived in what I call the beautiful and holy silence. I found peace not at the top of a skyscraper, but in the back pew of a church and in the quiet aisles of the library I loved so much. I proved that the system can be beaten, not with screams or noisy revolutions, but with the patience of a mountain and the discipline of a monk. I was the Judas of my own immediate wants so I could be the savior of my community's future. I deprived myself so that others could overflow. My redemption didn't come from the value of my J.P. Morgan or Procter & Gamble shares. It came from the moment I realized that truth doesn't need lawyers or press officers. Truth simply is. I died as I lived, without noise, but the impact of my silence now echoes in every life that will be saved in that hospital and in every child who will discover the world in that library. I didn't want a monument with my name engraved in gold. I wanted my effort to turn into pure utility, into real hope, into something that lasted much longer than my own flesh. I was redeemed by truth, and that truth is that you don't need anyone's permission to be extraordinary. I know you're wondering if it was worth it. Was it worth wearing an old coat for decades? Was it worth being called poor Ron behind your back? I tell you, with the clarity of one who now sees everything, it was worth every second. There is no pleasure in the world that compares to the feeling of being the master of your own narrative until your last breath. I was the architect of a myth that no one could destroy. I was the anomaly in the system, the error in the algorithm that proved virtue is still the most valuable currency there is. I wasn't a janitor who got rich, I was a rich man who chose simplicity to keep his soul intact and free of distractions. Now, my confession comes to an end, but your journey is just beginning. The world will try to convince you that you need more, that you are not enough without the next release, without the next applause. They will try to sell you a life of noise so you can never hear the voice of your own intuition. Don't fall into that trap. Be like me. Be the silence that deafens the noise. Be the ghost that owns the system. Remember that a man's greatest wealth is not what he has in his pocket, but what he is able to leave behind without asking for anything in return. Real charity is an act of justice done in the dark, and real freedom is the right to be invisible. If this story touched your soul, if you felt that there is something in you that no one can control, I have a request to make. It's not a request for likes or fame. It's a request for commitment to your own truth. Write "redeemed by truth" in the comments below. I will be reading each one of them, looking for those who, like me, understood that the secret of life is not on the surface, but in the depths of what we choose to hide from the world to protect what is real. I want to know who the new guardians of silence are. My name is Ronald Red, and this was my secret. I lived in the shadow so that my light could shine when I was no longer here. Don't just be another number. Be the anomaly. Be the silence that changes the world. I confess that, in the end, the only thing that really mattered was the peace I felt when I closed my eyes, knowing that I won the game without ever playing by their rules. I'll see you in the next revelation, where we will continue to unearth the truths they try to hide, but that the soul always recognizes. Until then, remember, the truth doesn't just set you free, it makes you invincible.